Listen to part of a lecture in a film history class.
Okay, we've been talking about the rise and reign of the Hollywood studio system in the golden age of the 1930s and 1940s. In those days, the studios essentially had a monopoly on the film business and a huge chunk of the overall entertainment business. Back then, many people went to the movies at least 3 times a week. And they saw pictures made by the studios, with stars under contract with the studios, and in theaters owned by the studios. But then in the 1950s and 1960s, I guess it didn't collapse, but it greatly contracted, and some of the studios did go bankrupt or otherwise disappeared. How did that happen? Ellie, you have an idea?
Isn't that when television began? I always heard television hurt the movies.
Well, to an extent, that's true. People could see motion pictures without leaving their houses, and that did cut into movie attendance. But there were other problems. Legally, the monopoly they had got them into trouble. They were forced to divest themselves of their theater interests, which cut into their revenue. And similarly, the actors were freed from those onerous contracts that bound them to a studio and obligated them to appear in whatever movies the studio heads decided. But the biggest problem was rot and complacency, just as with other empires. The studio heads, as well as their producers and directors, were all much older than in their glory days, and they lost touch with their audience. In other words, they basically made too many movies that people didn't want to see. The baby boomers were your age then, and they rejected the establishment in film as well as politics. Out of desperation, cracks opened in the studio system, and some young mavericks seized that opportunity, and arguably saved the industry. One such filmmaker was John Cassavetes. Cassavetes was a Greek American and didn't speak English until he was 7. As a young man, he fell into acting and worked in television, largely in New York instead of Hollywood. Using the money he earned that way, he began to write, direct, and produce movies. His second film, Faces, which came out in 1968, took him 3 years to make, on a shoestring budget, and was mostly shot in his home. It was a well-received, realistic view of the disintegration of a marriage, very different from the sugar-coated, happy-ending studio offerings of the time. Cassavetes also favored handheld cameras and improvisational work, both of which were a far cry from polished studio productions and dictatorial directors. Despite this, it was nominated for 3 major Academy Awards, and so began the ascendance of a new generation of filmmakers. This new generation created what is today considered a second Hollywood golden age.
But what about Martin Scorsese? Didn't he break new ground around then?
Martin Scorsese. Well, like Cassavetes, Scorsese grew up in New York in an immigrant family from Southern Europe, Italy in his case. And in fact, Cassavetes was a mentor and friend to Scorsese and encouraged his artistic vision. But Scorsese was about 15 years younger, and his first important film, Mean Streets, didn't come out until 1973, 5 years later than Faces. Furthermore, many felt that its rough-hewn style owed a debt to Cassavetes. And if you think about Taxi Driver, that wasn't until 1976. So, Will, you want to ask something?
Yeah, I guess maybe this is disrespectful, but if Cassavetes was so brilliant, how come we've never heard of him? Everybody here knows who Scorsese is.
No, not disrespectful, fair enough. There's a simple, sad human answer. Cassavetes died in 1989 at the age of 59. On the other hand, Scorsese is not only alive today, he's about 74, but he stayed active professionally. Since he turned 59, he's directed 6 major films, along with some documentaries and television projects. More artistically, though, Scorsese's lifelong ambition was to become a Hollywood filmmaker, and he succeeded. But that means that while he was a great and innovative talent, many of his projects had a broad enough appeal to command not only large shooting budgets and big stars, but lavish amounts for advertising and other support. Cassavetes, though, was a true contrarian, and it showed in his work. He made films on quirky, intimate topics and preferred to use largely unknown actors in many roles. Consequently, his films had far less distribution, and he is less known today. Nonetheless, serious students of film cherish his work and consider him an equally great artist.